to the Web3 Prof Podcast.
Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I'm here with Bob Summerwill, who is the Executive Director at ETC Cooperative. Thanks for being with me here today.
Well, thanks very much for the invite.
So, Bob, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself as far as how did you get into crypto? Where did this all start for you?
For sure. It actually started in a pub in Kitsilano in Derby's on a February morning of 2014.
Okay.
I had a pretty young child at the time. Kid had gone to bed. I'm like, right, I'm going to have a beer now. I want to have a beer. Nothing in the house. Okay. Off to the liquor store instead. And then as I was getting there, I thought, sod it. I'm going to the pub. I'm going to sit in the pub, watch a bit of hockey, chill out. I'm doing that. A guy comes, sit next to me, sort of starts talking. Hey, what sort of stuff are you into? And I'm just thinking, oh my God, please, I just want to chill out. But anyway, he, we found pretty rapidly we had a common background in technology, and he came out with the classic, have you heard of Bitcoin? And it turned into the most wonderful kind of conversation, one of these where you go from zero to, your utopian flying cars future. Yeah. Maybe you can have logistics and like self-owning trucks that are auto buying and crypto payments and shipping and all of this stuff. Anyway, with my new friend, he started taking me to meetups here in Vancouver. Mm-hmm. So specifically like at Decontrol was where most of the things were. And yeah, I started really following along. A little later that year, Vitalik was in Vancouver. He was actually spending the day with my friend, David Lowy. This was after the white paper. They'd started development, but the crowd sale hadn't happened yet. I think the Ethereum Foundation existed, but it was, very nascent. So I got to meet Vitalik really early. But I had got other interests myself at that time. My background was as a software engineer in the games industry. So I'd spent 15 years working on FIFA and other EA Sports titles up in Burnaby. But the reason I was aware of Bitcoin earlier, of course, but had kind of discounted it because I was a gold bug. And I'm a software engineer. I know how terrible most software is, right? The idea of putting funds in some program that some guys have written, it's like that or a bar of gold. That was kind of an easy choice. But I think I hadn't grasped the full scope of it either. I mean, obviously, like beyond, well, hey, this is a thing that can really work technically. It was also not so interesting if it's just money and payments, because it's like, well, we've got money and payments, right? Okay, store of value, but it didn't look like a store of value to me because of the software. But what was happening around that time in early 2014 was there was all of this kind of like Bitcoin 2.0 kind of talk, of saying, well, hey, you could have side chains and you could have like more programmability, and you got smart contract stuff starting to come in, and really the potential there that various projects were working towards to having something that was more like a platform, right? A platform for running applications, not just money. And the idea of that kind of, unstoppable platform for doing anything like that became really interesting to me at that point.
Was this, and when you're talking about this, are you referring to Ethereum itself, or are these like things that people were talking about building on Bitcoin?
But well, both. I mean, so at that time, the white paper, the Ethereum white paper, came out in December 2013. So it was like 3 months old.
Yeah.
It was just sort of a like, hey, here's an idea. but it wasn't a reality. You know, there wasn't even a test net or anything. It was just like, here's some white paper and ideas, and some people are kind of starting to work on that. But I mean, even prior to Ethereum, you had lots of these, you know, other projects trying to do other things. So, like two of the really well-known ones at that time were Counterparty, and colored coins. So colored coins being the idea that like you could like tag extra data onto a UTXO that would have some meaning to another protocol running on top.
What's a UTXO?
UTXO is as an unspent transaction output, and you know, if you have a Bitcoin wallet, you just think, oh, you know, I've got this many Bitcoins. But the actual reality of how those are represented is you have these unspent things, which I think you could think of them as being analogous to banknotes, right? You've got what you've got in your wallet, but what's actually in your wallet, you know, is 4 20s, you know, a 10, a 5, some coins, some quarters, and you know, that's the actual reality of money, is all of these things. And all of those have got like a unique characteristic, right? You know, you've got a serial number on a banknote. You can theoretically go and trace, well, where has that banknote been?
Right.
I mean, the only real use that there seems to be for that really is like if you've got giant amounts of stolen money, right? And it's like, you know, this batch, and they're all going to have the same numbers, and they're like, you know, pristine.
Yeah.
But yeah, so UTXOs, you can think of the components that make up money in Bitcoin. So the idea on colored coins is that you could sort of like attach metadata to one of these particular items. So, you know, you could have something that's represented there by that attachment. It's ordinals,
Right?
You know, ordinals kind of happened 10 years ago, of you know, and that's something really very analogous to in ordinals. You've got particular satoshis, right? And you're doing an inscription on the satoshi, which is like just writing a little bit of whatever. Though with ordinals, that little bit of whatever could be like a 4 meg JPEG or whatever.
Yeah.
But colored coins was that 10 years ago, and Counterparty was sort of smart contracts on top of Bitcoin 10 years ago. So lots of these things were happening. And yeah, you didn't really have the breadth of different assets that you do now. It was kind of like everything was Bitcoin, right? That's all you had. And you started having some, you know, altcoins that were really they're just straight clones of Bitcoin with some tiny tweak, you know, whatever, the blocks are faster, whatever, you know, some, you know, tiny little thing. Most of them were basically like worthless because they were just doing the same thing. Some of them, though, were kind of useful. Like there was one called Namecoin that was kind of like a DNS, you know, like pretty name, you know, so like mapping of a pretty name onto a nasty long hex address.
Right.
So that you could have a wallet with
a recognizable name.
Right. So that was kind of like a fork of Bitcoin, but like adding a few different operations to specifically like whatever add registration, update, or what have you. So there were some of those early, but what those were doing, they were kind of like, they were like application specific, right? They did one thing. Right. So it's like, right, this is the one for naming. This is a one for whatever, having some shares on a ledger or whatever. And what was unique with Ethereum was this sort of recognition. Well, God, we can't like make a new coin for every application in the world. Like, so if you do that, you've got to find people who are mining it. You've got to like whatever, talk to people to use it and all of this. So what Ethereum did was sort of this recognition. Well, you just need like something that's programmable, right? You need a platform. So in the same way as like, you know, iOS or Android or Windows or the web. It's like, well, you just need like a programming language, and it's a general platform, and then you can build anything on top of that. So I mean, so Ethereum was like the first in that area, but the idea wasn't new at that point.
So when we look at, I mean, you're wearing a shirt today that says Proof of Work, Proof of Work Summit 2023 in Prague. So maybe let's get a bit of an understanding of when you talk about proof of work, first of all, what is it and why is it important?
Sure. So proof of work is the basis of Bitcoin's block building and coming to consensus on a set of transactions. So you kind of had two innovations happening at the same time in Bitcoin, which are codependent, which is the idea of having a ledger of transactions, so that you can have, like digital money, and those are formed by having these blocks that are getting created. And proof of work is the process by which crypto miners make these new blocks. And the codependency there is, well, why would someone like do the work to make these new blocks? And the answer is, well, because you're rewarded in Bitcoin if you're the miner that finds the new block. And then it's like, well, but how does the currency exist to be able to pay them? Well, that's because of the chain, right? So those two things were intimately tied together, and specifically that incentive. There were lots of distributed systems, decentralized systems before that, but there was never like money to be able to incentivize certain behaviors before to that. So say BitTorrent, for example, right? BitTorrent, one of the best known decentralized applications there is, that was around, I don't know, a decade or so probably before Bitcoin. And it's like, hey, and you can share contents around peer to peer. But the problem is you haven't got money, you haven't got incentives. So you have a tragedy of the commons. Well, why should anyone like seed torrents? Why should you help other people, right? They're just sucking off your bandwidth and everything. So what you have with those, without those incentives, is, well, yeah, someone's going to rip off the latest Hollywood movie, but nobody's going to store your holiday photos because they don't care, right? But if you have incentives, people can start to care. So proof of work is the mechanism by which Bitcoin mining works. But then also there's various other proof of work chains, like Ethereum Classic that I'm working on, or Dogecoin, Litecoin, Zcash. And what proof of work specifically is referring to is the way that you make a valid new block. There's this like checksumming thing, right? Where the actual content of the block, if you do a hash of it, which is something that just comes up with like, a long unique number that representing those bytes, a miner has to produce a valid set of those, but there's an additional constraint, which is saying that number has to be within a certain subset of all available numbers. And this is a thing that they call a difficulty rating. So if there was no difficulty rating, then any block with that correct, kind of setup would be fine, right? And any valid block that gets made by any miner wins immediately. Or then you could go, well, what if you double the difficulty? And it's like only half the numbers are correct. So it's kind of like, the miners are throwing darts at a board, right? And the difficulty is like, how small an area do you have to be in? So what you actually have, at scale with Bitcoin mining now is, monstrously hard difficulty, that you can have warehouses full of full of these machines running 24/7, and and you're still only going to find blocks, rarely, because you're competing against everyone else in the whole world.
So when you mentioned Ethereum Classic, so can you explain to us the difference between Ethereum and Ethereum Classic?
I can. So there used to be a single project. So like I'd said, the Ethereum white paper was December 2014. The mainnet went live in 2015, in July 2015. And in 2016, one of the first major dApps got created on Ethereum. There were various things in that first year or so, but fairly small. But in 2016, something was created called the DAO. So DAO being decentralized autonomous organization. So DAOs, you could see them as kind of like being something that's like a company, like a cooperative, like a group, where you can collectively hold on to funds, and maybe you've got some voting mechanisms for deciding what to do or other things. So that's what a DAO is generally. And the DAO was basically like pretty much the first manifestation of that in the real world at scale. So you had basically this incredibly huge application that was built. It was doing like a crowd sale, so like an ICO. It was to get tokens in this, but it wasn't capped, and like nobody knew, well, what's it going to raise? So like Ethereum itself had only raised 16 million. I mean, it was one of the largest crowdfunding in the world at that time, right? If you look at Kickstarter and stuff, it was, I think it was like number 5 or something. It was, big. But for the DAO, it's like, okay, so maybe, if it raises 2, 3, 5 million, maybe 10, that would be a big success. And it went like 5, 10, 20, 30, 40, 100. And I think it was like 160 million it raised in the end.
Wow.
Just a monstrous, like, kind of success. And I think that's because there basically wasn't anything else to do at that time, right? If you'd got some ether, you're just sitting hodling, but you're like, isn't this meant to be like, a platform for applications? Like, where's the applications? It's like, here's an application. And the idea on the DAO was it was basically a platform for funding other projects. So the idea was, hey, you want to build something on Ethereum, make a proposal, and all the token folders are gonna have a vote and decide what the funding would go to. And interestingly, that wasn't like a donation model. It was like, well, hey, what's the return? It's like you make your proposal on the thing that you're going to build and how that, how the economics of that are going to work, and pay us back and pay us some gains.
So you would kind of get shares in the company, or you're kind of loaning your Ethereum to that dApp.
That's right. Yeah. So that's what the DAO was. And one of the other things, the other characteristics of that was, if you didn't like the way a vote was going, you kind of had this withdrawal option. It wasn't withdrawing all the way out, but they had this thing called child DAOs. So it's basically like, okay, right, there's stuff in the main DAO I either don't like, or I want to do like a spin-off and take people with me, right? We're going to go off and do the NFT DAO, right? Because we are only interested in NFT projects. So, we're going to go over here. So you could do this child DAO and like spin off and spin off. But the other thing that spin-off could do is like, okay, whatever, the main DAO is about to like give the money to some stupid project, and I'm like done here. You could create your own child DAO and say, okay, well, I'm off over here. And like my ETH is coming with me, and I'm just in this child DAO. But you could actually exit that in 30 days. So it's like, right, I've pulled it here because I'm out of here, and after that time, I'm withdrawing my ETH and I'm done. anyway, what happened with the DAO is somebody hacked it. It was really early days for smart contract tech. Ethereum was new. There weren't really any like good best practices. There weren't like off-the-shelf components or frameworks or anything. It's like, right, we've made a brand new thing. All the tooling is really new. And what we're going to do is we're going to make an immutable smart contract, right? And, well, it's not quite. They did have an update mechanism, but that was kind of, again, time-gated and voted on. So it's like, right, you can have a vote to like update the code, but it would take 2 weeks or whatever. And what happened is that there were vulnerabilities in the smart contract, and there were blogs about this from various people saying, oh, we think there's a problem with this, that, and the other. We're calling for a moratorium. Don't be doing voting. We need to like slow it down and fix it. But what happened is, even though the issue was identified, they hadn't had time to deploy the fix. But the information about the flaw was public. And what happened is some hacker went and hacked it. So someday people woke up and they're like looking at the balance of ETH within the smart contract, and it's like getting drained out. And it's like, well, what the hell's happening here?
Oh, wow.
It's like the money, the money's being moved off, and we don't know why, and like, there's sort of like a war room formed, and it's like, hey, everyone, if people can like spam the chain to like slow it down, and then George Hallam, who was like the communications guy at the Ethereum Foundation, was like, please stop trading. There's this group with like the exchanges in it, and it's like, stop trading, stop, panic.
Wow.
And yeah, when things settled, $50 million worth of Ether had been drained off into this dark DAO, this child DAO that the attacker had made. There were some white hat hackers who basically used the same trick to save what was left, though. It's like, right, that hack's happening. Well, we can do it back. We can pull it off over here, and we're good actors controlling like the 70%. But the thing that was kind of unique about this hack was many hacks, they're done and the money's gone already, right? Right, it's done and off, and maybe it could get blacklisted and some exchange could block it or whatever, but it's like, it's done, right? You're not fixing the platform. A lot of those issues are actually on exchanges, right? They're not to do with the blockchain. But what you had in this circumstance was you had 30 days before this guy can exit with his money. So that was really unusual. But what that meant is, well, what are we going to do? Are we going to do anything? Like, the DAO, it's like a bug in the DAO. And also that team had this really strong rhetoric about code is law, right? And it's like, hey, here's a written description of how the DAO works. But they explicitly said, in case of confusion, the actual smart contract code is the contract. So it's like, well, if somebody hacked it, you literally said that was the contract, right? They're not in breach of the contract. They did stuff that's within the bounds. And it's like, well, but there's a bug in the code. You literally said the code is the contract, right? So yeah, you had this real kind of sort of moral dilemma and philosophical split that you had within what was the Ethereum community at that time, where it's like, okay, so it's a hacker, but was it okay? Because, like, they just used what was there. But then if you intervene to try and rectify it, well, the blockchain is going to be immutable, right? Like, are you going to go back in and fuck about with it?
Was this the beginning of then the kind of movement towards proof of stake versus proof of work in Ethereum?
Not really, no. So in the Ethereum white paper of 2013, so Ethereum launched with proof of work, right? And there'd always been a plan to transition to proof of stake. That was in the original white paper. But yeah, I mean, what you ended up having out of the DAO, going on a little bit, was what ended up happening was a fix was proposed for this, which was basically like altering the blockchain. It was quite minimal, it was like a little touch, but it was basically changing the smart contract to be, okay, all that stuff, yeah, forget all that. It's actually just like a thing that lets you get a refund. So it's like, right, we're going to like change the world. Like, it wasn't rolling back transactions, but it was saying at this point, that smart contract, yeah, no, it's this. and it's just a refund. And all of that stuff with child DAOs and withdrawals, like all that shit, it never happened. Like, squash it back to nothing.
Right.
And this kind of split between, like, do you intervene or not? That's where the Ethereum Classic split came from, was that Ethereum Classic is a continuation of the original chain and the original project, and the thought that really, well, Ethereum is basically Bitcoin with smart contracts, and it's money, and you don't move people's money without private keys. So that subset of people, which is maybe about 15-20% of the total, were basically like, well, no, of course you don't intervene. There's not a bug in the platform. There's a bug in a particular application, however huge that may be. But manually changing an immutable ledger just invalidates the whole project. Right. So that's where Ethereum Classic came from. And Ethereum was basically like the fork of that, which, did the magic act.
Yeah. So when we look at mining today, there's a lot of rhetoric around the environmental impacts of mining, which, from what I understand, was one of the motivations for Ethereum to move from proof of work to proof of stake.
Yeah.
So how have things changed when it comes to our understanding or the environmental impacts of proof of work to what we know today here in 2023?
Sure. So, I mean, after the Ethereum Classic split, the other kind of thing that came out of that was Ethereum Classic got its own kind of character. And one of those things that came out pretty quick was people wanted to stay with proof of work. People who were in that, it's basically Bitcoin with smart contracts, wanted proof of work forever, wanted fixed supply. And I think where things have changed there is quite this sort of naive view, I guess, of electricity use and climate impact, which is still kind of prevalent in mainstream media, is the thought, well, you've got these boxes that are just burning electricity in a useless way, to make these criminal coins. It's usually a number of these different false narratives tied together. I think, this common element being, well, the whole thing's useless anyway. There's no real use cases. We're whatever, 14 years in, and nobody's using this apart from for ransomware and terrorist funding. So I think that's that's an element of it, is seeing the whole thing as useless anyway. But there is also this other major piece, which you see within the blockchain ecosystem, who are like aware that this stuff isn't just bullshit. but there are a large group of people that still are of that impression. Well, but doing that proof of work stuff is wasteful. So yeah, Ethereum did spend whatever 8 years getting to a point to transition to proof of stake, and then many of the other chains have started with proof of stake. But I think where that narrative is changing and that understanding is really changing has happened really probably only like 2020 onwards, and I think really what you've had is, especially with move of mining out of China, right? 2021 mining basically got banned in China, so pretty much all the mining moved to the US, and and stuff out of Kazakhstan as well. And what you had at that time is this real kind of shifting of energy sources. So in China, lots of coal mining power stations. So yeah, if you've got a coal mining power station, that power is being used to drive a crypto mine that's running 24/7. Well, yeah, that's not good for the environment, obviously. But that isn't the reality now of the kind of split of energy sources that you have in the countries where most of that mining is happening, and prevalently the US. And a real driving factor for that is that crypto mining is the most price-sensitive business that you can imagine. You're competing against the whole world, right? It's not like other businesses where, say, you're within a given country and you're just competing with kind of peer companies with the same kind of rules, same kind of setup. You're competing with the whole world, with vastly varying regulatory structures, energy costs, energy mix. And what that means is, you have to find the cheapest energy you can, because, those energy costs are some massive amount of your overall costs, like whatever, 2/3 or whatever of your actual costs. So you need to get to the cheapest power you can. And so there's really sort of there's more than two buckets, but two main buckets of that are stranded energy. So there are energy transmission is really expensive. The big pylons that you see, they're lossy, and it's a really pretty serious undertaking to move power over long distances. So you do have a lot of energy where it's not necessarily all needed at all times.
So is this like on a hot day or a sunny day, we might get a lot of energy from solar, or during a flood season, we might get a lot of energy from hydro, and we might not be able to use it all, so it just effectively gets wasted or unused?
That's right. Because the other thing is renewables are often very variable. The thing that was so sort of beneficial about fossil fuels, right? Burning coal, burning oil, burning natural gas, is that it's completely steady, right? Here's the machine, and it's whatever the gas is heating the turbines, and you've got a level power out of it. Same with nuclear. But many renewables are very variable, like you say. Solar. Well, is it a sunny day or not?
Yeah.
Is it the daytime? Is it the nighttime? With hydro, depends how much flow there's been, or tidal, or many of these things are variable over time. And then you have a storage problem, and you also have an overbuild problem, as into to cater for this variable amount. You often have to overbuild. Right, maybe you've got 10x more than you need in terms of the maximum amount that can be generated, because you kind of need more to ensure that you, at that peak, that you have sufficient. But then the problem is, well, if you've got more than you need, where does that go? And it's like, well, it goes nowhere. Like, a lot of it is just, excess heat, or on some of those, some things like on methane or gas, you might have flaring. It might be like, right, well, we can't use this stuff, so I mean, we're either going to vent it into the air or we're going to burn it, and it's just kind of wasted. So what you see happening more and more is co-location of crypto mining at the site of some of these off-grid resources. And what they can be is the buyer of last resort. Any excess you have, we're going to buy it. It's like, one of the analogies I've seen is like, if you're running a bakery and there's some dude who's like, whatever you've got left at the end of the day, I'll buy it. I love cakes,
Yeah.
I'm not going to pay you a lot, but I'm going to pay you more than nothing.
Yeah.
And so what is, well, we don't have to worry about like making too many in the waste. Like, it's going to be there, right? You've got this reliable revenue source. So what you can get off that is this massive incentivization of renewables through the crypto mining, in that it can help with that revenue source to get the financing in the first place. And then when you have that resource, you're not going to get any wasted stuff off it. So there's a company called Gridless who are operating in Africa, various places there. And the common pattern that they have is there is some underused electrical source. Like, often a lot of those are hydro. Whatever, there was some dam or like something in a river that's been built to provide electricity to a rural village. But they've got more than they need, right? Because you have to build more than you need, both for those peaks and troughs, but also just like expansion.
Right.
These things have maybe got 20, 30, 40, 50 years like lifespan to them. So, what's the demand going to be in those coming years? What kind of growth might you expect to see, both in terms of population or just in general? Electricity use is largely correlated with, improved civilization. If you have somewhere that's never had electricity, and there are lots of places in the world that are still in that state, well, it means you're not going to have lights at night. Kids maybe can't study in the evenings. You've got this sort of wasted time there. But also for heating, maybe people are burning charcoal, doing, they haven't got the pumps to like pump water around, so just using river water. So there's a whole bunch of areas where if you have power, you can make a better life. So yeah, if you have a power source, assume that usage is going to go up a lot. So yeah, what Gridless is doing is being that buyer of last resort,
right,
co-locating in, and then what that's doing is providing a revenue source to support that power availability. But the thing is, their usage of that can go up and down as required, right? If it's brand new, maybe you're using most of the electricity, right? There isn't a lot of demand yet. But as more and more actual demand comes in from those retail customers, then maybe, the prices are starting to go up. And that price signal is like, good job moving on down the line to the next place, that's kind of done its work of seeding that growth, and off we go.
And when we're talking about this, you're referring to all proof of work operations, whether it's Bitcoin or Ethereum or Doge or all of these different crypto tokens have the same principle here.
They do,
in moving to the cheapest place, in using renewable energy, in finding kind of the least resistant region to move into. Yeah,
that's absolutely the case. Bitcoin obviously, orders of magnitude bigger than most of the others, but exact same characteristics with all of them. That not only have you got like, you know, the simplest and safest and most robust kind of consensus mechanism there, but you do actually have something which has got a positive environmental story now. And maybe not so very many years ago, that wasn't so much the case. But if you look at a split of energy sources for Bitcoin mining over those last 3 years, you know, the graph of renewables is, you know, moving up rapidly. You know, there's more than 50% of mining is now with renewable resources, and a lot of that being hydro, and the best kind of energy mix actually of any major global industry, right? If you look at the energy mix used in, you know, whatever, agriculture and transport and electric cars, mining, all of them have got worse mix of renewables, and they're not changing. They're basically static. Whereas that crypto mining is rapidly improving. And the reason for that is because it is so price sensitive, right? It's incentivized to move to the cheapest places. Because if you don't, you're literally going bust.
Is it easier to move? Sometimes I've seen crypto miners set up in shipping containers, and so they're like relatively transportable. Is that have something to do with this as well?
Yeah, absolutely. That really you have this pricing and regulatory arbitrage globally of like, well, this stuff can happen anywhere. So if you have jurisdictions which are going to be hostile, well, you're not going to go there. I mean, you have got this sort of a bit of a risk where you see some stories about like whatever corrupt deals with government officials that are, you know, basically like screwing their citizens out of, you know, a good life. But I think those are fairly minimal. And what you really have is just like, well, that, you know, these businesses, because they are serious businesses now, you know, like a lot of Bitcoin mining is done by publicly listed American companies.
Right.
So, you know, those are, you know, they're going to go to the states that have got the best, you know, best kind of environments, and you can move around and yeah, you know, they will. I think there's very few other industries, if any, that can be so portable.
Right.
I mean, obviously like knowledge workers and humans working around, but in terms of like, you know, a physical business with machines and stuff, right? Yeah, you can't move that stuff around. And I mean that control is also like with time as well. There's this false perception, oh, well, Bitcoin miners, you know, they're just these machines running 24/7, whirring, and but the fact is, you can turn them on and off like in no time.
Right.
So another thing that you have, which is a great characteristic in some areas where it's allowed. So in Texas, for example, the energy people called ERCOT have a system called demand response, and many other areas have this. So what demand response is saying is, we will pay you to stop using power when we need it. So, right, there's a storm, you know, so notable story in Texas, you know, big winter storm, you know, causing havoc, you know, huge need for electricity for people, you know, putting all the heating on and everything, you know, like literally life and death situation, you know, people dying in the storm. And what you can have is just, you know, all the miners just turned off. It's like, right, woo, done. And, you know, that stuff is available to everyone else. And hardly any major industrial users could do that, right? If you're running a foundry, you can't like stop heating the, you know, the molten metal.
Yeah.
If you've got a hospital, you know, you can't like whatever turn all the machines off.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a grid stabilization feature where these kind of users being part of that system makes the system more robust.
What do you know about methane abatement or even flaring? Where does this come into play as far as mining?
Yeah, so I mean that's another great story. So I mean, we often talk about CO2, right? For climate change, it's CO2 levels. But carbon dioxide isn't the only warming greenhouse gas. There are many others, and methane is actually significantly worse than carbon dioxide. Is it CO4? Forget my chemistry, but it's another hydrocarbon. But yeah, I mean the figure I've seen is that lifetime methane can be 80 times worse than carbon for its warming impact. And you occasionally see these stories about cow farts are gonna like burn the planet up, and you hear of I forget what you call them in the Arctic, permafrost. Permafrost melting is releasing methane and so on. But one of the major sources of methane is actually landfills, municipal landfills. That we're just dumping tons of stuff, sticking a tarp or whatever on the top of it and just leaving it for decades. Those landfills can produce a huge amount of methane for decades at a time. And some of that is just vented. Some of these, they're literally, here's an open land site and up into the air it goes. Others of them are capturing the methane, but then are just flaring it. They're just burning it. But what you have a number of projects doing now, and it's a small number at the moment, but they're coming online fast, is using that methane as a power source for crypto mining. And it's a similar kind of economic situation to some of those, power supply for a village is generally for a municipal landfill. That's just a cost for the local government, municipal government or whatever, they just have to maintain that. But what you can have with pairing crypto mining with it is you give them a revenue source, right? You're just like, hey, can we come and use your site and we'll whatever share the profits, and you come in and you're turning that vented or flared gas into a very efficient energy source, and you're generating revenue off that, and those methane sources, like I was saying, they can go on for decades. They are a very stable thing, right? They're not varying in the day. I mean, maybe it's like more at the start and tapering off over time, but they have a long run.
Why don't the energy providers in the region just use that energy for the grid?
Well, I think it would usually be because it would be too small to
right.
To be worth doing that with. I mean, a lot of these stranded energy things, they do end up being little microgrids, right? They're quite small, they're quite compact, and that does give them that unique characteristic where nearly everything else can't use that. A lot of these are remote, and if you've got, hey, come and build your factory, in the arse end of nowhere in a tiny little place, and there's only power at certain times of the day.
Right.
That really doesn't work. But yeah, given that, 84x worse than carbon dioxide, there are some projections showing that if sites for methane abatement use for crypto mining come online fast enough, you can actually, within just a few years from now, actually be in a situation where crypto mining is actually carbon negative.
Wow.
Or carbon equivalent negative, right?
Right. So is that what you see? Like one of my questions I wanted to ask you is like, what do you see the future of crypto mining looking like? So is that where you think we're going with this? Because still the perspective is that while crypto mining is really bad for the environment, so Bitcoin is bad, Ethereum Classic is bad, Doge is bad. So what do you think the future is?
The polar opposite of that is actually true. A lot of these narratives have been changing through this year, and even just these last few months, August, September, October, there've been some major research papers, articles in mainstream press, which are actually Bitcoin environmental positive in a way that we just haven't seen before. So I think there was a series of good articles on Forbes. I forget the other ones. But we're starting to see this shift where all of the mainstream stories were always negative, right? It's just like, hey, here's the tropes, ha ha ha.
Yeah, it's like Bitcoin uses as much energy as the whole country of Sweden or something it was for a minute there, right?
Yeah, and there's actually a new one of those just this week. I don't know if you've seen this.
I haven't.
Okay, so the latest FUD is that every Bitcoin transaction uses a swimming pool of water.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So, we've only got limited supplies of fresh water. So, Bitcoin was boiling the planet, and now it's sucking all the water out of the oceans, and will leave an arid waste behind.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, in the same way as like with that, using as much as a country, or or they say whatever transactions, like as much as powering, a city for a month or whatever. I mean, nearly all of these are. I mean, they're just on the face of them wrong, right? It's like, even if you accept, say, that power use thing, well, you're mining the block, right? So if you've got 10 transactions in the block, it's not like a tenth of that stuff is just for that transaction, right? The mining is securing the whole chains and all assets in the entirety of 15 years worth of history,
right,
every time.
Right.
Oh, and adding some transactions, right? But that's secondary. But the other, like, total nonsense with that is that it assumes that all energy is the same, that you've got this homogeneous energy, that if you're using electricity, that is equivalent to the same electricity that, say, a customer is using in a major city. I'm in Manhattan, and I've got my fridge.
Yeah.
That electricity is the same as stranded energy in a hydro dam in a third world nation. Right. So, all of that, it's one analogy I saw is it's kind of like, oh, you haven't finished your vegetables. Don't you know there are people starving in Africa?
Yeah.
It's that kind of
I say that
piece.
to my kids all the time.
Right. and really, like, the reality is more like you have an army of ants that are going around the world eating crumbs, right? You're not taking food out of people's mouths.
Right.
What you have is this army of ants finding the cheapest and crappiest little crumbs everywhere that are not being used and providing use for those, right? It isn't a zero-sum game.
Yeah, that's really good. I think the idea around stranded energy is really important, and I think that's something that we're certainly learning more about. Bob, this has been a really great interview. I appreciate your time laying out a good understanding for how mining actually can be good and how it can be helpful for the world that we live in today. Thanks so much for being with me.
You're very welcome. It was great to be here.
Thank you.
Cheers.